Hello, everybody, and welcome to Ice-Burgh To Go, your daily dose of Pittsburgh Penguins news and analysis. You can find us on YouTube at Inside the Penguins or anywhere you get your podcasts from. If the Penguins weren't sellers before their road trip over the weekend, they certainly are now. 1-3-0 and 3 straight losses to finish off their trip to the Pacific Northwest. They now sit 9 points behind the Philadelphia Flyers for third place in the Metropolitan Division. They sit 10 points behind the final wild card spot in the Eastern Conference, aka it's open season for most of the Penguins. The only players that I would consider safe as of right now is the core: Sidney Crosby, Evgeny Malkin, Chris Letang, and Erik Karlsson. Kyle Dubas made it pretty clear at his press conference a couple weeks back that he is committed to keeping this core in Pittsburgh, and he's committed to building a winning team around them. The plan has changed over the course of the year because before it was, let's go with a lot of experienced players in the bottom 6. Let's go with a lot of high-scoring players in the top 6, and we'll let them balance each other out. Instead, it seems to be changed to this team will look to get younger. This team will look to bring in new blood to surround that core 4. Josh Yohe of The Athletic believes, outside of those players, obviously, 4 or 5 players could be traded this week. He said that in his 10 observations from the Edmonton Oilers game, and I tend to agree. So let's go through some of these players, talk about who is almost guaranteed to be gone, another handful of players that will be gone if the right deal comes along, and some players that are rumored to be on the move, but I find doubtful to be off the team in the next couple of days. Let's start with the players that are almost guaranteed to be gone at some point this week. Jake Guentzel's the foregone conclusion. He's done. He has played his last game as a member of the Pittsburgh Penguins. It's only a matter now of where he's traded to and what the return is. The reports coming out from Elliot Friedman of Sportsnet and 32 Thoughts, the podcast over the weekend, said the Penguins are looking for more prospects than picks in return. So we'll see what happens in the Jake Guentzel situation, but I fully expect that by Friday afternoon, he'll have a different jersey when he returns. I think he returns Sunday, so he'll have a different jersey the remainder of this season and probably going forward. Second player on this list, Lars Eller. I've talked about him the last 2 weeks as one of the most likely Penguins to be traded. I think it's a foregone conclusion that he is also probably traded by the end of this week. People tend to overpay for centers, and Lars Eller has been steady and consistent for the Penguins all season long. Not to mention, he's had a recent offensive surge that should inspire buyers to look in his direction a little bit more frequently over the next couple of days. I do believe that he's going to be gone. He's on a contract that has 1 year remaining at under $3 million for a third-line, fourth-line center. It might be a little bit rich, but what you're getting is a guy that can play the penalty kill. You're getting a guy that can finish in big games. You're getting a guy that has playoff experience, and you're getting a guy that, at his worst, is still a pretty good player. He has never been astronomically bad this season for the Penguins, whereas some other centers around the National Hockey League and even some centers on the Penguins have been at points in the year. He's been steady as she goes, and that's why he's going to have so much trade compensation, trade talk surrounding him over the next couple of days. I fully expect Lars Eller to be traded by the end of this week. And the last name on this list, I'm going to throw it out there because on 32 Thoughts, the podcast, again, going back to the old well with Elliot Friedman, he said Alex Nedeljkovic more likely than not to be traded this week. He's been a solid backup for the Penguins all season long, and anyone looking to shore up their goaltending tandem will come calling. Not to mention the fact that he's probably not going to command much in return. The Penguins might ask for a mid to low round draft pick in return, and or, since they're skewing towards prospects, maybe they just reach out and ask for a prospect. They need forwards, they need defense, they need basically everything but goaltending in return for Alex Nedeljkovic. So I fully expect Nedeljkovic to be on the move as well. Now let's move over to the next little pod of players here that will be gone if the right deal comes along. Noel Acciari tops my list for that one. Talked about him, I believe, as the 5th most likely Penguin to be traded a couple weeks back. Special teams is a major factor in the Stanley Cup playoffs, and Noel Acciari has been the Penguins' best penalty-killing forward all season long, and they haven't done much consistently this year. but they've been pretty consistent on the penalty kill, and a large part of that is Noel Acciari's ability to win faceoffs, his willingness to block every single shot that comes his direction, his physicality, his ability to play the game in an intelligent manner. So I do believe that Noel Acciari, if the right deal comes along, will end up getting traded this week. His penalty killing is great. It's going to garner interest. The only question then becomes, does somebody want to take on that contract? He might not be a center in the perfect situation. He might be a winger in the perfect situation. But I do think that on the fourth line of a contending team, Noel Acciari can do a lot of damage. Another name on this list, I don't want it to happen, but I can see why he would garner a lot of interest, and it's Marcus Pettersson. They need to be blown away. Like I said, this is all players that will be gone if the right deal comes along, but they would need to be completely and utterly blown away for the return for Marcus Pettersson for them to even consider this happening. He is a top 4 defenseman on every single team in the National Hockey League, and he is a top pair defenseman on almost every team in the National Hockey League immediately upon entry. That could fetch a very, very lucrative return. But if it's not there, if they're not getting it offered, there's no reason the Penguins need to trade Marcus Pettersson, especially because this isn't a team that's looking to blow it up per se. They're not looking to start the rebuild. They're looking to, I guess it'd be called a shotgun rebuild or a quick turnaround rebuild or whatever you want to call it. They want to compete next season. They want to get younger, but they want to compete next season. They want to be in the playoffs once again next season. They want to give this team an opportunity to be a Stanley Cup contender at some point. Now, that seems like a very far-off proposition based on the team that we've watched over the last week, but it starts this week with the trade deadline, and Marcus Pettersson is a big piece either way. If he is traded, you're getting a lot back in return, and as we saw, you're going to be getting a lot of prospects back in return that you're hoping are closer to being NHL ready than a lot of the Penguins prospects currently are. If you keep them, you keep your best defensive defenseman. So it'll be an intriguing storyline to follow. I don't think he is going to show up on any most likely lists, but to think that he is untouchable would be a misstep going into this week. So we'll see what happens with Marcus Pettersson. 2 names that have floated out there a lot. We've talked about them a lot. It's really depending on, does anybody want to take these players without retaining salary or without needing a draft pick coming back to force them to take the entire salary? Riley Smith and Rickard Rakell. I don't think both of them will be traded, but there's a good chance one of them will. Riley Smith more likely than Rickard Rakell simply because of contracts. Smith has 1 year left at $5 million. Rickard Rakell has 4 years left at $5 million, but I also think that the Penguins are better off keeping Rickard Rakell over Riley Smith anyway. Yeah, Rakell has had a bad season. It's been a season in which he'd probably like to get a reset on, a redo on, but he's shown it in the past with this organization, whereas Riley Smith has not shown it in the past with his organization. He's looked lackluster at points this season. He's looked lifeless at points this season, and that's besides the fact of the games where, like Sunday night, the entire team looked lifeless. He's looked lifeless throughout the majority of the year. He's had some solid runs with the Penguins, but at the end of the day, it just isn't a good fit, and sometimes that happens. So maybe for a guy who won the Stanley Cup less than a calendar year ago with 1 year remaining on his contract, maybe, just maybe, somebody's going to take a chance on Riley Smith and take that $5 million off the Penguins salary cap. And that's huge. If they're able to do it, sure, they could get a draft pick back. Sure, they could get a prospect back, whatever. But the biggest asset you get in return is his contract off the books for next season so they can go out and try to fix, whether that be the hole that he leaves behind or try to fix another hole on this team, because there's going to be a lot of them this summer for Kyle Dubas. The last name in this list of will be gone if the right deal comes along, I guess it's Chad Ruhwedel. His name started coming up a lot more in the last week, and I thought to myself, really? I mean, it's interesting because he's a guy that is the picture-perfect 7th defenseman where he can sit out for 2 weeks, 3 weeks, eat popcorn and nachos in the press box, and then come down and play like he's been playing for the entire time. So maybe in a playoff atmosphere, in a league where the playoffs are about attrition and staying as healthy as humanly possible, and even if you don't stay healthy, who's able to step up and who's able to step in those big moments, those weighty moments. As a third pairing defenseman / seventh defenseman, Chad Ruhwedel's pretty good in that role. He is. He's actually had a fairly good season. He's been buoyed by a lot of interesting characters to his left. P.O. Joseph with him has not been great. He's currently stapled to Ryan Graves. He's drawn the short straw on that one. As of late, John Ludwig working through injuries, working through, getting his feet wet at the NHL level. Same thing with Ryan Shea. So a lot of different cast of characters next to Ruhwedel this year. He's played fairly decently, right? So whoever wants to part with a decent asset for him, they're probably going to get him. It's not going to take much. Similar to Alex Nedeljkovic, probably even less so. It's going to take maybe a conditional 4th round pick, maybe a B- prospect, but Chad Ruhwedel is another name that could potentially be on the move if the right deal comes along. Here are the last two I want to talk about before we get ready for this crazy week, and hopefully before this entire podcast is outdated by a move that gets made in the next 2 hours. Here are the two players that I think are rumored to potentially be on the move, but I think it's doubtful. I think that it's very unlikely that either of these two are on a different team by the end of this week. Let's start with Tristan Jarry. His name's come up a whole heck of a lot, and that's a good thing for the Penguins. His name's come up because he's had a good season. The Penguins rolled the dice with him, giving him a 5-year deal at a little over $5 million a clip last summer, and it's paid off big time. Now you have a bona fide number 1 starter on a solid contract. And I know what everybody's going to say. Yeah, but he can't win in the playoffs. He hasn't really had much of an opportunity. He had 1 series and then 1 game. I'm not as worried about that at the moment, simply because what do we care about the playoffs? The Penguins aren't going to the playoffs this year, the 2nd straight year. He's certainly not the reason because of it. So they have a bona fide number 1 starter on a solid contract for the next 4 seasons. It's hard to find starting goaltenders in this league. Now, can he do it consistently? That's the next question. But so far this season, there have been no reason to doubt Tristan Jarry. I would say that because of that, it's unlikely that he gets traded. Yeah, there's a lot of interest around the NHL. Yeah, I'm sure somebody's willing to part with a lot of assets or good assets to get Tristan Jarry. But what did I say at the beginning of this entire episode? They're not burning it down. They're not taking it down to the studs. They're trying to compete next season. And the best way to try to compete next season is to make sure that you have solid goaltending. And if you're starting from scratch for a second offseason in a row, because let's not forget, last offseason, the only goaltender under contract was Casey DeSmith. When the offseason began, when Kyle Dubas came in, the only goaltender of record was Casey DeSmith. He flipped that, turned it around, and made it a strength for the Penguins this season. You really willing to roll the dice for a second year in a row? Are you? I've looked at the free agent class for goaltenders. It's not great. It's not great. Not a lot of bona fide number 1, specifically at the age of Tristan Jarry, who are just entering their prime years. So I would say rumored, sure, but doubtful for Tristan Jarry. The other one, I'm kind of leaning the other direction. Obviously, Bryan Rust is going to garner a heck of a lot of interest from the Pittsburgh Penguins, from other teams to the Pittsburgh Penguins, excuse me. He's probably the biggest asset outside of Jake Gensel that they have if he's available. Gensel on an expiring deal, you get that for $6 million, and you get a bona fide playoff performer who could be a top liner anywhere. With Bryan Rust, you're getting a guy that can play your penalty kill as a third line grinder. He can play in your top 6 as a talented score a couple goals in a big game in a series type of way. He's a 2-time Stanley Cup champion. If the right deal comes along, you have to take it to Rust and try to, at the very least, sell him on the destination. He has a full no-move clause right now. But if that deal comes along, say it includes an A-plus prospect or a high first-round pick or maybe both, maybe both. It might be an overpay, but sometimes teams do that this week. If that deal comes along and somebody says, if you can get him to waive his clause, we'll give you a very lucrative return, you have to take it to him. And I believe that Kyle Dubas will. He's been steadfast on that they haven't asked anybody to move or change their trade clauses. He doesn't plan on having to ask anybody to move or trade their trade clauses. He wants to honor the contracts that the players have signed. Out of respect for the team, especially the players that have been here and have been part of the winning culture here for several years. Brian Rust is included in that. But I don't think Kyle Dubas is in a position where he can turn his nose up on a very lucrative return, which is what I believe some teams will call and ask for to get Brian Rust. So it's going to be an intriguing week. Trade deadline week, always on the edge of your seat. Always, for me, very nerve-wracking when I'm recording because any second something could pop off and I have to scrap 16 minutes of my life. But as of right now, nobody has been traded, at least as of recording this, and this is coming out an hour after I record it, so hopefully it stays that way. But there could be a lot of movement for the Penguins over this next week. It's a big week for Kyle Dubas. Pivotal week for the team next season because building next year's team starts today. Building the future of the organization starts today and starts this week. That's going to do it for this episode of Ice-Burgh To Go. Thank you guys so much for tuning in. Remember, you can find us on YouTube at Inside the Penguins or anywhere you get your podcast from.